We find a security problem with it, and Canada is going to make a decision at some point. We're not using Huawei, and we're really some of our great companies are getting much involved with 5G right now. But no, we find a tremendous security problem with respect to Huawei.
That was U.S. President Donald Trump speaking during his bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on the sidelines of the NATO summit in London. Right now, Canada is mulling whether to ban the Chinese firm Huawei from its next generation mobile network, known commonly as 5G. The U.S., Australia, and New Zealand have blocked or limited Huawei, citing national security concerns. But Canada might also be weighing China's current detention of two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Ali Khan Velshi is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Huawei Canada. He joins us now from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Velshi. Nice to see you. Thanks for making time for us.
Thank you so much for having me again.
I wanted to start off with the decision that the federal government is anticipated to be making sometime in the future on Huawei's participation in this country's 5G network. The Liberals said they kind of punted it towards after the election. We asked the Department of Public Safety today, and a spokesperson told us that the review is still underway and, quote, "We will ensure that our networks are kept secure and will take the appropriate decisions in due course." How has the uncertainty over that decision affected Huawei?
I mean, I think it's important that the government take the time to get the decision right. And, they clearly have undertaken a process, and we're going to be respectful of that process. At the same time, we have a business to run, and we continue running that business while doing what we can to provide whatever information the government needs to reach whatever decision it ends up reaching.
Do you have any expectation on the timeline?
I'm afraid I don't. Your guess is probably as good as mine.
And has there been any correspondence between your company and the new Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair?
No, there has not yet. I do anticipate us reaching out to his office at some point in the next little while.
What is the is there an impact on the fact that a decision hasn't been made on your bottom line, or is sort of operating under the status quo feasible for you?
I think at this point, none of the operators in Canada have deployed 5G technology. And so, there are spectrum auctions that still need to take place before that becomes a reality in Canada. And so at this point, we're still operating in a 4G world and kind of a 3G, 4G world. And so we continue selling equipment to our existing customers as we have always done, obviously working with the government and various security agencies with respect to the programs related to those sales.
Do you think this is going to be a decision based on technological considerations, or do you think this will be a political decision?
I have confidence that the government of Canada, that the experts in the government of Canada will not allow politics to sway their decision-making process. The information that we've received from our cooperation at the officials level is that they're taking very seriously the importance of 5G towards Canada to making the decision right. And so our view at this point is that we have every reason to believe the decision will be made based on technology.
There is, of course, a great political consideration for the federal government right now. You're as aware as I am of the deterioration of the relationship between China and Canada following the arrest of your company's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, in Vancouver about a year ago. Over the weekend, she posted, I guess it's a blog on Huawei's website. I just want to read a passage. She says, "Right now, time seems to pass slowly. It is so slow that I have enough time to read a book from cover to cover. I can take the time to discuss minutiae with my colleagues or to carefully complete an oil painting." Was this blog post tone deaf?
Look, I mean, I don't think that someone who spent the last year under house arrest, I don't think is, a polished public relations expert. She's describing what she's going through. She's describing what she's feeling. And she communicated that to our employees and to others. Not going to characterize it beyond that.
In light, though, of what's happened to Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who remain detained and have been for over a year, I think they haven't been able to even see their lawyers. We know that they're under some duress. I'm not exactly sure of every condition that they face, but it's not a comfortable situation for them. Should your company have posted something like this?
I mean, I think, look, with respect to the two Michaels, our position has been clear. We're concerned about their treatment, and we hope that, the two governments, our government in Ottawa and the government in China, can figure out a way to get the relationship back on track and bring them home. At the same time, it's the one-year anniversary of Meng Wanzhou's detention, and she has every right, as a CFO of our company, to express what she's feeling and to describe what she's undergoing to our employees. And I think at the end of the day, I haven't walked a day in her shoes, and so I'm in no position to judge what she does.
No, I understand that she has the right. I guess my question is more aimed at the fact that while this will be a decision eventually that's based on technology, at the same time, there is a perception of the relationship between Canada and China and your company in this country now because of the last year that could very likely inform what the government ends up doing. And my guess is Canadians who have been following the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, detained under the conditions that they are versus the conditions that Meng Wanzhou has faced, would be disheartened to read something like this.
I mean, I think I agree with part of the premise of your question, that this whole situation, this whole mess has become increasingly politicized. Just about 2 weeks ago, we had President Trump sent some of his officials to Canada to try to bully us on decisions related to 5G. Just over the weekend, the Globe and Mail published a truly remarkable piece of investigative journalism where they found that Donald Trump's disgraced former national security advisor John Bolton was behind the original decision to extradite her.
Is that your company's belief as well?
I have, at the end of the day, I have total confidence in the reporting of Bob Fife and Steve Chase. So that's the first thing. I've learned not to question their reporting through long, hard, bitter experience. However, it is consistent with the position that we have always taken at Huawei, that Canada has been caught in the middle of a trade dispute between President Trump and China. That is to say, at Huawei, we've never said that Canada was sort of a willing, active, or participant in this. We've always felt that Canada was dragged into this and is a pawn, just like we believe that Meng Wanzhou is a pawn and everyone else affected by this trade dispute is a pawn in this Donald Trump trade dispute with China. And all we can do, as a company, is hope that the relationship between Canada and China is not allowed to further deteriorate in the face of what's happening between the U.S. and China.
If it is the belief of your company that this is all because of the U.S., has that been communicated to the Chinese government?
I mean, I'm honestly not sure, what communications take place between Huawei and kind of, foreign government in China. Certainly, the position that our founder, Mr. Ren, has taken publicly in interviews with the media has been that he bears no ill will or ill feeling towards Canada for detaining his daughter. Quite the opposite. He feels a great deal of sympathy for the position that Canada has been put in. I think we all do. And his hope that he continually expresses when he's asked by reporters is that, he just wants to get the Canada-China relationship back on track. And that's why,
he's but my understanding is there is a relationship between your company and the Chinese government to some degree. Has the CEO or has anyone else in your company raised the idea that this is not Canada's fault with the Chinese government? Obviously, I'm asking because the Chinese government doesn't appear to have that position, doesn't appear to be on the same page.
I mean, look, I'm not sure what you mean by there's a relationship between Huawei and the Chinese government. Huawei is a private company in China. I realize that's sort of an unusual situation in a Chinese context, but it's a private company in China. And I would imagine its relations with the government there would be similar to any one of its subsidiaries' relationships to the government in their jurisdiction. So, we're in daily contact here in Huawei, Canada. Daily, probably a bit less than daily, certainly weekly, with officials in the government of Canada, and I would assume that the GR team up in China would do the same with the government there.
The concerns raised by the United States, for example, is that the relationship is so close. That's why people should be worried, they argue, about letting Huawei into 5G networks.
The United States, I find, certainly the Trump administration talks out of both sides of its mouth on this issue. On the one hand, Donald Trump sends his heavies to Canada to bully and lecture Canada on decisions that we should be making, that Canadians should be making, asking
Our
the Canadian
intelligence
government
networks
to be
are very
tougher.
intertwined, though.
So, well, let me just finish my point briefly. So, telling us about decisions we should be making, but at the same time, in the U.S., they're offering exemptions to Huawei with respect to, delays and 90-day delays on the entity list. So, in Canada, he wants tougher treatment of Huawei, but in the U.S., they continued to make it easier, grant exemptions for U.S. companies to do business with Huawei. So in many ways, he wants Canada to suffer the consequences of this rather than Americans.
It's not just President Trump, though. It's many Democrats as well who have come out with concerns about your company.
Look, I think that there's a bipartisan nature to what's happening in the U.S., but it's very clear that it's Donald Trump and his aides, like John Bolton, former aide John Bolton, who have been driving this because they continue being caught red-handed, including by the media. They can't help themselves.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, but thank you very much, Mr. Velshi. I appreciate your time.
So happy to be on.
Ali Khan Velshi, Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Huawei Canada.
Thank you.
I am Bashi Capellos, host of Power. In London, NATO leaders have gathered to mark the alliance's 70th anniversary, but instead of celebration, there were clashes today over military spending. Here's what happened in the one-on-one between U.S. President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
What are you at? What is your number?
We are increasing significantly our defense spending from previous governments that cut it.
Okay. Where are you now in terms of your number?
1/4. And
They'll get
continuing to move
They're
forward.
getting there. They know it's important to do.
The CBC's Evan Dyer joins us now from London. Hi, Evan. Nice to see you. Thanks for doing this. Tell us more about the face-to-face between the Prime Minister and President, particularly that exchange we just heard.
Well, it was actually more of a Trump news conference than a real exchange in the sense that Donald Trump spoke about 95% of the time. And actually, we just heard some joking off-mic comments between Prime Minister Trudeau, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Mark Rutte of the Netherlands was there, and also Emmanuel Macron of France. And both Macron and Trudeau, who were not aware that they were being recorded, were joking that they had been props in a Trump news conference that went on for about 40 minutes, 31 minutes to be precise in the case of Trudeau. And indeed, there was some talk of money. This is one of the issues, of course, that Canada knew it would have to defend itself on here. The U.S. has always been pressing other members for decades to contribute more, but that's become a really intense pressure campaign under Donald Trump. The threshold that NATO countries are supposed to aspire to is 2% of GDP on defense, and Canada falls significantly short of that. It's around between 1.3 and 1.4, depending on how you count it. So we expected to see some pressure. There was some pressure, but President Trump also didn't appear to be really aware of exactly how much Canada paid, and he seemed to accept Justin Trudeau's explanations around it, that Canada may not hit the 2%, but it does a lot. It contributes troops and ships in places like Latvia, Romania, and Iraq. Other members who might nominally spend 2% don't necessarily do as much. So he did seem to accept that. And he distinguished between Canada, which he called slightly delinquent, and which he said he was confident would be okay, and other countries, particularly one he called out, Germany, which he described as delinquent, said he might even take trade measures against them to make them pay more, and even hinted again that he might not honor the treaty commitment to defend them if push came to shove.
And as you mentioned, Evan, it seemed like Canada kind of escaped or the Prime Minister kind of escaped the President's ire, but that doesn't necessarily mean, as you point to with the criticism where Europe is concerned, it's happy times at this summit, does it?
Not at all. And in fact, we've seen a lot of insults in the run-up to the summit, and they've continued here. You know how, of course, a month ago, almost, President Macron referred to NATO as suffering brain death. That annoyed a lot of other leaders. Turkey's President Erdogan, who's been questioned a great deal about some of his actions, such as buying Russian weapons, pushed back saying perhaps Macron was dead and accusing France of supporting terrorists. That's a reference to the Kurdish YPG. Today, we saw President Macron push right back and directly accuse Turkey of working with ISIS, which is, of course, about as serious an allegation as you can make against a fellow NATO member. But speaking of ISIS, we saw also a very unusual exchange between Macron and Trump in a very testy bilateral meeting that occurred slightly before the Trudeau meeting, and again touched on the matter of ISIS. Let's look at that.
Would you like some nice ISIS fighters?
Let's be serious. The very large number of fighters you have on the ground are ISIS fighters coming from Syria, from Iraq, and the region. It is true that you have foreign fighters coming from Europe, but it's a tiny minority of the overall problem we have in the region. And I think number one priority, because it's not yet finished, is to get rid of ISIS and these terrorist groups. This is our number one priority. And it's not yet done. I'm sorry to say that. Yes, you still have fighters in this region, in Syria and now in Iraq, and more. And the whole destabilization of the region makes the situation more difficult to fix.
This is why he's a great politician, because that was one of the greatest non-answers I've ever heard.
So there you go. That gives you a kind of a flavor of the very tense and testy exchange that those two had. And of course, President Emmanuel Macron was once leading a sort of a one-man charm offensive to be Europe's bridge to Trump's America. Obviously, he's changed tack there and now feels very free to call him out quite openly. And he is one of the people pushing for a more European-centric, Eurocentric defense that could potentially one day emerge as a rival to NATO, but certainly very much the spokesman for the doubts that Europe has about NATO in the era of Trump, the doubts about the U.S. commitment to Article 5, the mutual defense clause that underpins this treaty. And those doubts have really undermined this conference and have left the alliance looking a lot more frayed than it has in years.
All right, thanks for the update, Evan. Really appreciate it. The CBC's Evan Dyer for us in London. Since becoming president, Trump has upped the pressure on NATO allies to spend more on defense. Member countries have committed to meet a target of 2% of GDP by 2024, but those countries currently spend less than that, many of them, including Canada, as you can see on the chart there. Concerns over NATO's future also hang over this week's summit, especially after French President Emmanuel Macron called the organization brain dead last month. So, does NATO's fate hang in the balance? General Tom Lawson is a former Chief of Defense Staff of the Canadian Armed Forces. He joins us now via FaceTime. Hi, General Lawson. Nice to see you. Thanks for making time for us.
Pleasure, Bashi.
I want to start off with the question that the president directed towards the prime minister around defense spending and as it is a portion or as it relates to a portion of GDP. What is your take on the evolution, I guess, of the kinds of pressure applied to Canada to meet that 2% target?
Well, I attended the gathering in Wales at which 2% was introduced as the goal. It was the UK hosting, of course, and the Americans agreeing that 2% would be a good figure for the 28 members at the time to aim for, now 29. I think, certainly Canada has been taking a bit of a peace dividend over the years, and therefore we were lagging somewhere just around 1%, maybe 1.1. So it was going to be tough. However, I think when Canada signed on back then, the idea was that the timeline not being nailed down would allow us and many other NATO nations some wiggle room. That has changed, of course, with the new American administration.
Was there concern at the time from the administration in this country, from the government in this country, about meeting that 2% target?
Yes, I think there was. I mean, to jump from a percent, just under 20 billion, to 2% at 40 billion, is debatably too much for a country of our relative security. And yet we are lagging, certainly a lot of the other nations in NATO. And I think the Americans, by bringing this on so quickly, sort of forgot the fact that although they have financed so much of NATO for many of its 70 years, they got something in return for that. They were given a leadership position, the undisputed leader amongst the partners in NATO, and that has changed around very quickly in a short period of time.
Do you think, sir, that Canada should be aspiring to hit that 2% target?
I think Canada should be aspiring to increase the defense budget. And I think there are various ways we can do that that will not only meet this kind of accounting need from NATO, but also some of the things that sit untended to right here in Canada. Of course, the Prime Minister has spoken about fighters, and that project, though it's grinding along slowly, is grinding along. But I think the North Warning System, together with our American friends to the south under NORAD, would be a very good place for us, for Canadian security to invest. And that, of course, would be added to the figure that right now is at, at 1.3 or easing towards 1.4%.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but just reading between the lines there, you said it'd be good if we spent more, but you didn't exactly say that we should be hitting the 2%. Is that an accurate reflection of where you sit?
Yeah, I think that is. I think it's a little trite it's fine as a goal to say 2%. However, you were talking about a Canadian GDP in a country that's enormously strong and very secure by comparison to many of our NATO neighbors. Therefore, I'm not sure, even as a recent chief of defense, I'm not sure that 40 billion in today's dollars or more is exactly the figure we need to carry out all of the responsibilities associated with defending Canada. However, I do think some significant figure more than we're at right now is a very responsible way of approaching.
What do you think of the American argument put forth, not just to be fair by President Trump, but by President Obama before him, that essentially other countries aren't pulling their weight and they can't continue to expect the United States to jump to their defense if they're not willing to put in more? That's essentially the argument that they've put forth.
I think it has some validity. I think to press people on a proportion of their GDP is a valid thing. But I think, and this has often been the Canadian argument, you also have to look at how loyal a partner each of these NATO nations has been in then changing that defense investment into defense involvement. And Canadians and the Canadian Armed Forces have always been there. I can't think of a mission in recent decades in which Canada was not a full and largely contributing member. Let me just back off. Not largely contributing, but a contributing member of very high quality forces.
What's your take on the effectiveness of NATO as a military alliance right now at this juncture? I'm asking because we've heard, for example, French President Emmanuel Macron criticize it recently and particularly focus in on the U.S.'s role and how that's changed under President Trump. Do you think that NATO is as effective as it could be?
No, but it's what we've got. It's 29 nations, all of whom I think we can say we would like to align ourselves with. Some of the leading economies in the world and certainly democracies, almost all of them democracies that are highly respected around the world. So this is the group that's brought us to the year we're in now, and I think we better be very, very careful to make sure we maintain the solidarity while at the same time respecting outside thought, like President Macron's when he or Mr. Macron's when he says we've got to do some really good thinking about the future of NATO, and especially so when the Americans are so clearly, at least this administration, perhaps changing their tune as to how much they would support it, and in the deepest cases, whether they would be there at all.
What do you think the greatest threat to the solidarity in NATO is right now?
Well, I think that it's difficult to very quickly find an undisputed leader of the 29 nations. Now, maybe we never really needed one, but that's what we got used to. For nearly all of the 70 years, the Americans have provided a good portion of the funding, and the Americans have had a very good say in which way we were going, and they were listened to. When they want to give up, when they want to cede that ground by leveling out investment, it's very difficult then to find who can be rallied around. And this is what you see the struggle is right now. Who is the leader of NATO? Do we need a single leader? And if we don't have a driving figure, one driving figure, how can we have kind of a grouping Security Council, to use UN terms, that provides us a good way ahead. With 29 nations sitting around the table, that's a very, very difficult thing to do if you don't have an undisputed leader.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how necessary do you think having a leader is?
Well, I think that's to be found out. I'm not sure. It's what we've had. The Americans have been our undisputed leader even around the military committee meetings that I was in. Usually it was the chairman of Joint Chiefs who was our lead speaker. And it was a very comfortable fit. It was someone who was watching from outside the European theater and who would speak with great confidence and great sources of intelligence. So I think that's an open question, the one you've just asked, and I think the way ahead is to determine how do we more easily share that burden of leadership across some of the leading NATO nations.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your insights and your time this evening, General Lawson. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Bashi.
General Tom Lawson, former Chief of Defense Staff. Despite pressure from U.S. President Trump, Canada does still have 5 years technically to reach its NATO spending target. But does this government intend to do that? David Perry is Vice President, Senior Analyst, and a Fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's currently attending the NATO Engages event. He joins us from London now. Hi, Dave. Nice to see you.
Good to talk to you.
Thanks for staying up so late for us. I wanted to start off on this idea of unity. We heard the Secretary General of NATO underscore the importance of remaining unified earlier today, and that was followed by all these sort of apparent clashes between various leaders. What's going on?
Well, I think in one sense he has a problem with some of the presidents, Trump, Macron, and Erdogan. The issues that the French and the Turks are pointing out are definitely kind of distracting from what a lot of the other allies think is the real key issue in regards to how the alliance can deter Russia. And certainly the clips you were playing there give certainly a flavor of some of the wider conversations that are happening right now. And kind of a split in the alliance between those that are more southern facing, that are facing both the migration and a terrorist problem coming out of North Africa and the Middle East, and having that come home to their own home soils, as has been the case in France. And for people that have had that more immediate experience, they're more fixated on the problems in Syria and the Middle East and North Africa than they are in some of the other issues that the other allies to the east or to the north are facing with regards to the Russians. And that's a really kind of clear dividing line within the alliance.
Do the clashes between the leaders have a potential effect or an immediate effect on the effectiveness of NATO right now, do you think?
Well, it certainly, I think at the political level, it does make it more difficult to get progress on any of the issues when you've got sort of divided camps that don't think that one of the other sets of those big strategic